Elden Ring's 1-year anniversary is almost here, and it is still one of my favorite games. As a long-standing FromSoft fan, it feels to me like the culmination of everything that was great about its predecessors, and its astonishing sales numbers seem to back that up. A well-thought-out open world, memorable boss encounters, and beautiful art direction, where every time you stop it looks like you're standing in the middle of a painting. All these things make this game, in my opinion, one of the best games of this generation. One thing that always stood out to me, however, and that I want to talk about today, is the apparent lack of hand-holding and player guidance that allows you, the player, to explore and discover the lands between at your own pace and with only your curiosity to guide you. But is there really a lack of guidance? Does the game truly not tell you where to go and leave you on your own? Or do the developers use some subtle tricks to actually get you to where they want you to go? Today I'll show you some of the methods that were used to help you find your way through Elden Ring's amazing open world. Some of these may seem obvious, while others are hidden in ways you might not have thought about before. So, without further ado, welcome to the open world design of Elden Ring. Open world games face the problem of providing the player with a great amount of freedom and choice, while at the same time trying to tell a coherent story, or at the least have the players experience certain events in specific order. This is not always an easy task, and if done wrong, players might get lost and stop playing the game, or they'll disregard the open world entirely in favor of experiencing the story, making the game being open world pretty pointless. So, how do developers make sure that players won't get lost? Well, the easiest solution seems to be to give them a map, plaster a bunch of icons on top of it, and mark quests and important locations with a convenient path from point A to point B. This has been the standard for many games in the past decade and is generally referred to as the Ubisoft formula, named after the developer that popularized and heavily uses this exact method to make sure that players won't miss any important or unimportant information. The problem with this approach is that instead of exploring and experiencing the open world, most players will just use it as a kind of checklist, going from objective to increase some arbitrary completion percentage. It usually feels more like busy work instead of actual exploration. Other games, like for example the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, have used a similar approach, but instead of having icons on the map from the beginning, you get a compass displayed at the top of your screen, on which icons pop up when you are close to a point of interest, and only after you have visited the location will it show up on the map. Additionally, quest markers are shown on your compass and floating around the world as well, so that you always at least know the general direction of where you have to go. Another thing a lot of open world games use is a quest log, where all the quests the player is currently following or has followed in the past are tracked. Most of the time with extensive details, sometimes even recorded conversations. This helps to figure out where you have already been and what is left to do. So the question now becomes, how does Elden Ring use these systems, and does it use them at all? The short answer is yes, but in Elden Ring, traces of these systems can be found, but instead of solely relying on them to navigate the player, they are instead used sparingly and only where it makes sense and is necessary. Take for example the compass. Elden Ring does have one, just like Skyrim, but instead of showing you locations nearby, it just shows you what direction you're heading in, almost like a real compass. The only time it does show you something else is when you die and lose your runes, so that you have a better chance of finding them again, or when you have marked a spot on the map yourself. Speaking of which, Elden Ring does have a map, which is a first for FromSoft games. The map, however, is not overloaded with icons right from the start. Instead, it functions similarly to Skyrim's map, where icons only appear after you have already been to a location. More than that, the complete map is not even visible to begin with. You only get a brown, greyish thing with only some major paths drawn in, and these small obscure icons that you may learn symbolize pieces of the map in the actual open world that can be found and put together to reveal the layout and terrain of the surrounding area. Incidentally, the other game praised for its amazing open world and focus on exploration instead of guidance, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, did something very similar, where instead of giving you the entire map, it would give you only sections, and in those sections only the rough terrain would be visible. This leads to an interesting occurrence where I, for example, would see something that looks strange or caught my eye on the map as it is revealed, like this out-of-place green area up here near the Altus Plateau, and I would want to go there and figure out what's happening there. This way, the game can guide you based on your own curiosity instead of putting a big question mark on points of interests. It just makes them interesting instead. As for the quest log, Elden Ring does have that as well. It looks like this. But jokes aside, Elden Ring does have some systems that are similar to a quest log, but not really. For example, quest markers. Elden Ring does use them, but only on very rare occasions and only when it makes sense. Like for the Volcano Manor quest, where you have to go to specific points on the map and invade some NPCs. The only other similar thing are these paintings that can be found in the world and will be added to your inventory, where you can look for the locations they depict to get a reward. As of patch 1.03, they also included icons for NPCs at locations where you met them, so that players would have an easier time completing quest lines or at the very least check up on NPCs every now and then. Previously, you would have to put a marker on the map yourself. These things help you keep track of some important information, but they don't spell it out for you. You are still responsible for remembering and interpreting most of the information you get, and I at least found this to be a lot of fun, but I can definitely see this being an issue for others. The last obvious guidance system is the aptly called Guidance of Grace, and it's the main way the devs use to push the player towards the path they want them to take. At certain sites of grace, a golden shimmer can be seen that roughly points towards the next grace, creating a path to the next main encounter of the area. This mostly helps players determine if they are currently following a main path or if they are taking a detour and completing optional content. But even those paths may sometimes end in roadblocks like the first boss most players encounter, Margit, the Fell Omen. At that point, players are told by the game to follow the path, but they are currently too weak to progress. That way, the devs guide the player to explore the lands between and return at a later point in time. All this leads to a more natural exploration experience, as players will have to actually think about the world and how they interact with it. There is no checklist to be followed except the one you create yourself. So in the end, Elden Ring uses the same systems that the other open world titles have used before it, but it tunes them back a little bit and gives more affordance to the player to act on his own. In that sense, the game suggests to the player more than it actually guides them. However, there are some even more subtle ways the game helps you find your way around its world and how the developers suggest a direction or give information to you in ways you probably wouldn't even have noticed. First off, the world itself. While technically being an open world that can be almost fully explored right from the start, it is built with a more linear design in mind. Mark Brown from Game Maker's Toolkit made a great video exploring the world design of Elden Ring. In this video, he explains how the different areas of the map are connected, and while there are some paths that connect most of the areas together, they are mostly hidden, and players will only find them after gaining some more knowledge about the game in general. From my own first playthrough, and from what I've seen online, most people more or less take the same path through the early stages of the game. Everyone starts in Limgrave and begins making their way towards Stormvale Castle. After they encounter Margit, they will usually turn back and explore the rest of Limgrave. During that time, they usually find the trapped chest that takes you to Caelid, escape the tunnels, and decide that Caelid is not a place they want to be in. In the end, they return to Margit, make their way through Stormvale Castle, and end up in Liurnia, where they now take on Raya Lucaria next. At that point, it gets harder to guess, but my assumption would be that after defeating Renala, most players either go to Caelid to collect the second medallion for the elevator, or go through the hidden path that lets them go to Altus Plateau. Some may also stumble across a way to enter Mount Gelmir, but I think that's a minority. That is more or less the general path everyone takes, which is also backed up by looking at the Steam achievements. This is what I mean when I speak of linear design. The world may be open to explore, but players will still follow the path the developers intended them to take. Of course, this only works because of the systems mentioned before that guide you through in this linear fashion. Otherwise, people would most likely just stumble around Limgrave and be overwhelmed by the vastness of the lands between. However, there's one thing I haven't mentioned yet, a very subtle and almost unnoticeable thing FromSoft did with its world that subconsciously suggests a path to you without explicitly telling you to go somewhere. I'm talking about framing and composition. Usually these terms are used to describe paintings, art, or films, not video games. That's probably because the latter usually doesn't have fixed camera angles to frame something outside of cutscenes. The player is in control of the camera, and the developer can never be sure that they will frame the right thing at the right time. FromSoft, however, made it work, and they used some clever tricks to do it. The best way to showcase this is by looking at the beginning of the game. After succumbing to the strongest enemy in the game, or the Scion, you get a short cutscene, at the end of which your camera helpfully points towards the door you must go through next. After taking control of your character again, you also see a silhouette glowing to your right, next to a message and a hole in the ground. You also see an item, just like the one in the chapel, glowing on the ledge above you, which gives you an immediate goal if you want to complete the tutorial. And of course, there is the door you were just shown, as well as a small glowing tree, almost like a miniature Erdtree. But do you notice something else? The composition of this picture shows two highlighted sections, the tutorial to the right, as well as this middle section that stands out due to the lighting and the way it is in the center of the image and framed by these rock formations and the general darkness of the image. You may also notice that the tree and the stairs form lines that all point towards the door, drawing your attention towards it. That's your first hint there. After you step through the door, you encounter your first grace, if you haven't played the tutorial that is, and continue towards an elevator. It's in a small and uninteresting room, so you turn your camera towards the only interesting thing, the door in front of you. So now you're facing the door again. As soon as you open the door and step outside, an impressive scene reveals itself to you, and this is where the magic happens. To explain it, I have to go into more detail. First, you have your most immediate goal in front of you. You see the Grace and Vare standing next to it, so this is where you want to go first. Then you can see the tree sentinel on the right here, being your first obstacle that you have to overcome. You may also notice this church, but we'll get back to that. The Erdtree is, again, towering over everything, just like in the tutorial, and even if you might not know it yet, it is your ultimate goal, and you see it right from the get-go. To the left, you see Stormvale Castle, towering above the landscape, and even further to the left, you see a place that you might recognize as the place you started at. This immediately gives you a rough idea as to where you are, and since you know nothing else as of now, the place where you died, or better, Stormvale Castle, become your first destination that you ultimately want to reach. Now, back to that church. What makes it so special? It's the place where you meet your first merchant, that teaches you about crafting, as well as the place Rani the Witch will make contact with you during the night. It's an important location, so how do the developers communicate this? Did you notice all the lines pointing towards the church in this frame? They are everywhere. Everything you see points more or less towards this one place as the first place you need to go to. And the best thing is, you won't even realize that while playing it for the first time. This technique of framing certain important locations and using lines in the geometry to guide you are used all over the game and help you without explicitly telling you anything. Just by looking at the environment, you can instinctively tell where you need to go next. It happens in Liurnia when you enter it through Stormvale Castle. The Altus Plateau gives you multiple hints depending on where you are entering from. The Endel points you to the final boss and shows you the path to get to it. And finally, when entering the mountaintops of the Giants, you don't see your final goal, but instead the secret area you can uncover, planting the idea in your head that you have to go there at some point and making you look for a way to get there later on. Another example that's just so much fun to me is here in Siofra River, where this pillar has been cut off just so you can see Mogwyn Palace as you enter it. When reaching it later on, you immediately know where it is because of the unique sky, and it is framed in a way that draws your attention. Speaking of the sky, the game does this as well in every area. You can almost immediately tell where you are in the world just by looking at the color of the sky and the grass. This, together with landmarks like the Erdtree and other imposing sights that you can see from everywhere, help you find your way through the lands between while not getting lost in them. I find it astonishing how much thought went into every detail and how much the game does without telling you. To come to a conclusion, I'll quickly go over everything again that Elden Ring does to help you navigate its world. It does rely on some of the systems other open world games use, like a map and some markers, but it doesn't front load the information. It only helps the player to keep track of information they already know of. The game suggests a direction but never forces the player to go that way. Yet its linear approach to open world design make it so that most players will automatically follow the path intended by the developers. Finally, FromSoft uses subtle hints in the environment as well as tricks in the level design to get players to frame certain things in specific ways and help them make decisions based on what they see, instead of outright telling them where to go. Clever use of colors and landmarks like the Erdtree makes sure that the player never gets lost during his travels and can always find his way around. All this helps make Elden Ring one of the most memorable and fun exploration experiences of last year, and maybe all time. I can't wait for an eventual DLC, and I'm excited to see what FromSoft has in store for us next. The next time you play Elden Ring, keep an eye out for those subtle hints and see if you can find some more. If you do, let me know, and if I've missed anything or made a mistake somewhere, please feel free to correct me in the comments. I also have to give credit to Reddit user Sader for creating this image of the Limgrave example I used, which was basically the whole reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. I also want to thank Mark Brown from GameMaker's Toolkit for helping me appreciate the world design of Elden Ring even more than I already did. Links to their original content, as well as some bonus links if you want to read up on the topic of framing and composition in video games, are in the description. With that, I'll say thank you for listening, and when I find something new that interests me, you will hear from me again. Until then, keep playing.